truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold these truths
truths
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. If you haven't noticed, progressives are trying to transform society with verbal tripwires and digital witch hunts all around us. Their war on fun isn't just limited to trying to keep you locked in your home for the last few years either. They've attempted to take the fun out of many of the pastimes we cherish, like sports, comedy, or even the food we eat. If you've ever been attacked by an hysterical leftist family member for celebrating Thanksgiving or enjoying a football game free of social commentary, you've been the target of the war on fun. And our guest today will give us his thoughts on how we can fight back and ultimately how we can live a more meaningful and enjoyable life and reject the Puritanism that plagues our society and the politicization of everything. Noah, thanks so much for being on.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, Congressman. I appreciate it.
So for our listeners, Noah Rothman is on the show today. He's an editor at Commentary Magazine. Contributor to MSNBC and NBC News, graduated from Drew University and with a degree in Russian Studies and Political Science, earned a graduate degree from Seton Hall University in Diplomacy and International Relations, author of Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America, and recently the new book, The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun. All right, so we were just talking before we started recording. Why write this book about the Puritanism of the left, or is it also the right, or is it just kind of the general politicization of everything?
This book begins with a mystery, right? Because traditionally, the mental habit that would see in innocent cultural products something that would corrupt you and degrade society for all our adult lives is a trait that was pretty much native to the right. The left, by contrast, would emphasize self-fulfillment, self-gratification, even hedonism, perhaps even at the risk of self-destruction, but emphasizing if it feels good, do it. And then perhaps maybe about half a decade ago, things began to change, and we are now treated to moral crusades from the left. And you notice them because they are being executed by people in command of the commanding heights of the culture, entertainment companies that are introducing really plottingly didactic narratives that don't advance the plot of any particular entertainment product, but that make them more socially valuable than mere entertainment. Comedians dwelling on the pain that somebody had to experience so that you could enjoy a punchline. And as you said, sports broadcasters shoehorning long digressions about American race relations into the coverage of a football game. And when fans object, as they often do, they're admonished by their betters for clinging to their need for some sort of escapism, because escapism is an abdication of your moral duty to dwell on the world's horrors at all times and in all things. And so the mystery is, why did this happen? How did we get to this role reversal? And the theory that I lay out in this book is that if you tease out the intellectual history and the threads that connect modern progressivism with the progressivism of the 19th century, its earliest iteration, you find yourself in the middle of a Protestant moral crusade. It was as much a moral program as a political program. Mm-hmm. Pull on that thread a little bit more, and it's not long before you get to the intellectual history of the puritanical movement that evolved into the moral policing of the 19th century. So as progressives begin to identify more with progressivism and less with liberalism, they've adopted its habits of mind. They're paranoid about your banal activities. They have a utopian conceit, and they have a fear of idleness. That which is idle, which is not actively contributing to the progressive project, is likely undermining it. And it's not a private practice, which would be one thing. It would be unobjectionable if it was a private practice. They aim to draft you into this. They might not recognize the Puritanism in their philosophy, but that's vanity. And I hope this book illuminates the intellectual origins of their own philosophy and provides some ways for you as an objector to live a joyful life and to perhaps have license to mock people who are making a hysterical spectacle of themselves.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said on all of those fronts. What are the underpinnings of this ideology? Because like one of the things I notice about progressivism is that it seems to be often to be just change for the sake of change. You know, you look at, I don't want to call it right-wing Puritanism, but Puritanism. Are we getting that right?
It's a mouthful. I struggle with it sometimes.
But let's say like puritanical Christians, let's say that at least has some basis. There's a Bible, and there's thousands of years of history and a culmination of kind of tried and true practices that culminate in a moral framework and a belief, of course, that that moral framework is divinely inspired. So that there's an anchor there. You can't change that too much once it's set, and it either works or it doesn't. And I think Christianity tends to work. It is, again, time tested. The major religions are time tested. This is not. This is progressive religion, and you noted some of the you used some religious language to describe how they see it or how they operate. With their sins and their incantations and all of these and these rituals that they proceed in. They evangelize their new religion. My question is, what the hell is it? And how is there any anchor? What gods do they worship? Where did it come from? Or is that not even the point?
Well, there are no gods, which is why I don't think it's equivalent to a religion. I agree that it mimics a secular faith, but there's no avenue for expiation. You can't absolve yourself of sin.
But you can if you hate is that the whole anti-racist thing? Isn't that sort of a form of?
There is no license for you to stop doing the work. If you stop doing the work, you're abdicating your moral duty. And that's why I think Puritanism is a real decoder ring to try to figure out how this thing evolved and what its aims are, because it's not just a religion. It transcends religious practice. It transcends political practice. It's a mixture of both. It's a way of life, a theory of how societies should organize themselves, much like Big P Puritanism did. So I organized this book in the chapters are organized by unimpeachable virtues: piety, prudence, austerity, a fear of God, temperance, and order. Because there's a very old theory of social organization and morality and propriety that progressives are rediscovering. Where I'm most sympathetic to it, perhaps, is in the chapter on temperance, which is on sex and booze, not drugs, sex and booze. And they've rediscovered something that conservatives have long known, which is that when men and women find themselves in social situations that are also bathed in alcohol, bad things can happen. Socially disruptive things can happen. And you're finding this previously licentious culture is rediscovering a theory of social organization that preserves order, that establishes boundaries for you, boundaries for your loved ones and your neighbors and friends and relatives, and maintains a harmonious set of social relations. And I think they've just rediscovered this. This is a brand new theory. That you mean like
in kind of like the Me Too movement and all that, and this sort of is that what you mean by rediscovering?
Yeah, right after the Me Too movement, you had organizations like Vox that was putting limits on the amount of alcohol you can consume in social situations. You had businesses that were getting rid of Christmas parties entirely, in part because of the fact that there was booze there and men and women were socializing, and this was entirely disruptive to the social fabric. Likewise, when it comes to sex and interpersonal relations, you don't think of the modern left as prude in any way, shape, or form, right? But if you dive into the literature around the many proliferating sexual identities, it's not self-gratification that they emphasize. It's the political program associated with those identities and the self-actualization and self-fulfillment you can find in those identities. Couple that with the fact that we have, from statute and conventions, statute in states like California, and social conventions in universities and what have you, a labyrinthine effort to establish consent, to establish consent beyond what the statute allows, because sexual harassment. A labyrinthian effort. I like the phrase. I mean, because consent.
Good. It's very descriptive. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, they understand that harassment and assault is more nebulous than what criminal statutes allow. So they've created this social order in order to keep everybody ordered and social relations harmonious. But the practical effect has been to terrify young people to the point where they exist, much like Big P Puritans did, exist in a very confusing world that is permissive, as long as you can navigate this, as long as you maintain respect for everybody. But at the same time, they understand that if a cue is misread or a sign is overlooked, there are real social and even legal consequences. The result is that this generation of young people is less licentious, less adventurous, less chill than their grandparents. They would object to that strenuously, but it's a fact, and they need to be confronted with it.
I think I've seen some statistics to demonstrate that as well. And maybe some of us would think this is a good thing, by the way. Like drug use is down, sex is down, video gaming is like way up. So what other factors might be involved in this? Is it?
Well, that's the weird thing is, when you listen to people who do find something valuable in this, code of conduct, they're like, well, STDs are going to be down, teen pregnancies are going to be down. And I'm immediately thrown back into the 90s, where abstinence-only education was regarded as such a backward-looking phenomenon, a Neanderthal vision of how people should be expected to navigate. The personal responsibility you're expected to display is undermined by this idea that you have to be constrained in this cosseting social culture. And that was the critique of conservatives when I was growing up. It has now been fully adopted and embraced by the progressive left. That
is interesting. All right, let's talk history here. What are the linkages you see between actual Puritans of the 16 and 1700s and progressives today? How do you link that history?
Yeah, so big P Puritans of the 1600s, 1700s get a really bad rap. They were not nearly as puritanical as the stereotypes that come to mind when we think of Puritanism are. And scholars of Puritanism get very frustrated by that, because we're kind of conflating in the popular imagination big P Puritans and the Comstockery of the 19th century into which it evolved. So the kind of moral policing of the 1800s that became what we understand today to be a prudish, blue-nosed Puritan. It was more mainline Protestantism, where, by the way, progressivism was birthed. This is the cradle of modern progressivism. And there's a reason for that. The behaviors that I see modeled by the new Puritan, again, there's a moral framework and a virtuous framework at work here. It is in the excesses at which it is it's applied, and the behaviors in which they engage in. So, for example, the work, profound discomfort in displays of labor that you must engage if you're going to seek a spiritual goal, an endless pursuit of education, re-education, speaking out, being silent, all of it involving duress. You're expected to suffer in the pursuit of this goal. Self-deprivation, a willingness to sacrifice that which is enjoyable, from the entertainment that you enjoy to the food you eat. You are to proscribe and demur and reject these earthly pleasures, because they provide you with a nuanced vision of society. You understand that which other people are going without, because you are engaged in abnegation yourself. Demographic essentialism, which is a puritanical goal, and the kind of sumptuary laws that they had there. Outward displays a uniform that shows the society at large who you are, what you were born into, to whom you are subordinate, and the projection of inward insecurities. What one of the scholars that I quote frequently in the book called anxious introspection, which is this idea that sin lurks in unseen places beneath placid surfaces of banal activities. The sin, the sinner, and the environment in which the sin are committed exist along a same continuum. They cannot be separated. And if you have this enlightened understanding of the world you inhabit, you can pull back the curtain and see the hideous hidden workings of the world. And that allows the new Puritan to find in banal activities like fly fishing and gardening and running and jogging and half a dozen other sewing, things that you wouldn't think are imbued with racism. They are in fact imbued with racism. This is a sort of a spiritual understanding of our environments. It's not empirical, it's not falsifiable, but it does provide you with a sense of mission, a sense of purpose and self-satisfaction, because you're contributing to a perceived social good. It's not gratifying in the physical sense, but it's very satisfying in the spiritual, emotional sense.
But why? Is it just because being part, being part of something? I think people are always looking for some kind of religion. Maybe they don't like the Christian God, and so they, you say there's no gods in progressivism, and that's not really, but kind of, right? I would say the gods of anti-racism. There's the gods of climate change. There's in some senses they do kind of worship Mother Earth, right? Because everything comes back to either racism or climate change. I think those are the two main categories.
Right. I would add economic disparities as well, but those are the three legs of the progressive stool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah. But I mean, again, like, why is it purpose? You know, I mean, why we're as conservatives, we're always struggling to figure this out and kind of read the minds of our fellow citizens. And it's tough. Is it related to some other of these leftist philosophers like Herbert Marcuse and Noam Chomsky? Yes. And how do they relate to this? How did this movement progress from Puritan, you know, the like you said, capital P Puritans, to more modern leftist philosophers, to whatever the hell it's become in the last few years? Because again, like we're talking about Marcuse and Chomsky, they're old. This was a while ago. It did seem like we were more sane in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. It's only lately that it's really gotten a little weird. So mapping that out is tough.
It's very tough and very disorienting. I kind of hope that this book helps you get, a roadmap to try to help figure out this puzzle that we've all been staring at for the last 7 years. You mentioned Marcuse, which is a good place to start. So in the 1960s, 1970s, the emergence of the New Left and the intellectuals on the New Left who were licentious and hedonistic and elevated the Playboy philosophy, for example, as to a set of virtues and values. But there were dissenters on the left during this period. They didn't have a very big audience. Marcuse was one of them. His most famous essay recommends intolerance towards free expression, because that creates fertile soil where fascist roots can thrive and eventually develop. A Foucauldian theory of desire, which sort of politicized sex, and people like Susan Brown Miller and Andrea Dworkin, who were famously hostile to heterosexual coupling rituals. They didn't have much of an audience in their times, but they have since found one. An older sense of propriety. They were too much for their contemporaries, but an older sense of propriety is gaining a foothold on the progressive left. And whether they've read Marcuse or not, I suspect they haven't. They are mirroring his philosophy, all of which is kind of rooted in a suspicion and condescension towards your fellow man. So let's take some concrete examples from today, for example, how this philosophy is applied to stand-up comedy. First, it requires a lot of condescension towards comedian or people who consume comedy, particularly on the right. There's a gentleman in this book who wrote an essay for the New Republic, Seth Simons, which identifies the roots of the alt-right in the early 2000s, and they were birthed by this form of comedy called cringe, which leverages unspeakable things for comic effect. Racism, sexism, homophobia, assault, the sort of stuff that you would say, well, if you enjoy that kind of joke, much less tell it, you're probably a bad person. But that's a clinical description of dark humor. This is from time immemorial, a phenomenon that helps mankind navigate intolerable circumstances. It's the essence of gallows humor, to leverage, to plumb the depths of human suffering for entertainment. So Simons identifies in that form of comedy the genesis of the alt-right, draws a straight line right to the January 6 riots and says, it started here. It started here with Laurie Kilmartin. How? It requires an element of condescension on his part, because he doesn't think that the stand-ups acting out, talking about these antisocial behaviors on stage will act them out. But you might. We don't know about you. Couple that with a rising progressive tendency to regard laughter as sort of a trite pleasure. So just to identify one person that they've elevated to prominence is the Australian anti-comic Hannah Gadsby, who is funny when she wants to be. Sometimes she doesn't want to be. She'll build the same tension that would otherwise lead to a punchline, but not give you the punchline. Just let you marinate in the tension. Circle back to a punchline she said 5 minutes ago and interrogate your sense of humor. Why did you think that was funny? That was my pain. Why did you enjoy that? And that's what they love. They don't love the punchline. They love the pain. They love the torment. They love the anguish. They love the seriousness and sobriety that they perceive when they think of themselves as being so serious that they can reject a simple pleasure like a laugh, especially if that laugh comes at the expense of somebody else. Now, that looks to us like fanaticism, but to them, it's a mark of their seriousness of purpose, and that is satisfying to some degree. But it makes you exhausting. It makes you a miserable person to be around. And that misery is unsustainable in the absence of a coercive mechanism, which is from time immemorial, the town square. It used to be a literal town square, and now it's the town square that resides in your pocket.
It's also unsustainable in the absence of some kind of elevated moral sense, right? Like you've got to believe that you're truly doing it for the right reasons. And, again, what is right to them? Is it fight, and they use words like equality and justice, I think, to create this facade of moral propriety on this. I don't see how else they do it. And I guess it's persuasive to some people.
I mean, you have to have utter self-confidence to presume yourself to be able to perceive the right, much less to adjudicate, moral claims and conflicting values in the absence of a mechanism, like a judicial mechanism. I don't even know what it exists outside conventions like law and government, which is why law, government, the workplace, unless your workplace is creating a cultural product, and education do not make an appearance in this book. This book is about the stuff that should exist outside of politics, should be entirely apolitical, cultural fare, enjoyable, sensual activities that do not lend themselves to legislative remedy, that have nothing to do with legislation, have nothing to do with electoral outcomes, aren't politics properly understood. They are political, which is very different. We've reconceptualized politics as something politics is not. And that's psychologically disorienting, and I would argue damaging, because you get a false sense of what the American system is capable of doing. You've invented this moral urgency around the exigencies that you think are absolute imperatives, but the mechanisms of the system do not respond. So you do one of two things. You either drop out of the system because you're super depressed, it doesn't work for you, and might never work, and so you back out. And then the other option is you radicalize. You resolve to attack the foundations of this wholly immoral system that isn't responding with the proper alacrity to your moral mission. So what we have left with are the fanatics, the most zealous, the most radical, the most committed. Those are the people who are still in the arena. And it gives us a distorted view of what the political consensus is, whatever the majority is, which is always hard to discern. But we have no idea what majority sentiments are now in this country, because there's this fatalistic conceit that's abroad.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're describing a problem overarching in politics on all sides, and it like you're saying, the regular people that want to have pretty regular conversations, they might go to a meeting, a Democrat or a Republican county meeting, and they're like, "Whoa!" So like, what? I'm not going to come to the next one, And so yeah, it's the harshest, most dedicated Puritans. Start to
I will never
control.
forgive the pandemic for forcing me to go to a school board meeting. The last thing in the world I ever wanted to do.
Yeah. I mean, you ever been to an HOA meeting or listened in? It's like all of these. I mean, it's a lot of people are like, I'm sure somebody else will figure out. What I encourage people is somebody else is not figuring it out. Like you do have to get involved and offer that voice, and don't let the really, really loud ones drown you out, because the louder they are, it's usually a sign of insecurity. The louder someone is, it's usually a sign that they are truly in the minority, but they want to make it seem like they aren't.
Absolutely.
And as far as these progressive Puritans go, I mean, the good news is I've seen some studies on this. Maybe 7% of people probably are truly like this. Just like, and it's the same would be on the right as well, because there's certainly a right-wing Puritanism that is absolutely insane.
Of course.
And frankly, getting a little worse recently. I mean, we have words for, rhino hunting. I mean, it's become clownish and stupid. But
I read a little bit more about that in my first book, sort of a temptation towards extrajudicial mechanisms for resolving political temptations. And that's on the right and the left.
It's heretic hunting, it's witch hunting. It's Puritanism. Sure. But I forgot where I was going with that.
Well, there's there is an equivalency, but I would stop short of saying that the right also sees world historic import in your burrito. They have not gone so far in that direction as to divine from their cultural understanding which is valid and proper and historical understanding.
The right is focused very inward, right? They're focused on heretic hunting within their own ranks. And that's the beauty of conservatism. I wouldn't call some of these idiots conservatives, but the wonderful thing about conservatism is that it does live in a box. The whole point is limiting principles, therefore limiting how far you can really go. And so, they always talk about right-wing fascists, and I'm like, what right-wingers are you? Certainly not conservative fascists. Those are oxymorons.
And preserving institutions and mechanisms for good or for ill, and mostly for good, frankly, but because they've survived this long for a reason. But that's the default conservative orientation. The progressive orientation is precisely the opposite: to remake the world anew. And so they continue to stumble into eternal truths that they've only just discovered yesterday.
I know what I wanted to ask you, because I was talking about how few and far between these people are in reality, but they do seem to have an outsized effect on our culture. As you were writing this, how many of these people were you able to talk to? Because I'm always looking to get behind the veil of somebody who's like, going on and on about anti-racism or these just fanatical, emotional approaches to things. And being in politics, I see how people start acting very quickly, like they're a normal person 1 second, and then they bring up their phone and they want to get a reaction from somebody, and they start acting. They start acting like this insane person. And I always wonder, like, what's real? Or and the unfortunate reality in our society is that people see that person, they're like, that's authentic, and I'm like, right, that ain't authentic. Like, what you're seeing is a total lie, and people have been lied to so much by the mainstream media and all these things that they now look for people who will lie to them even more, which is the deepest, darkest internet circles.
We reward performance art.
Absolutely, right. That's authentic. But anyway, how many were you able to interview anybody on this stuff? I mean, like why are you trying to cancel the burrito? Like what?
Yeah. Now, we've all had contact with this mentality. The people I wanted to focus on more aren't the committed progressive Puritan, because the objective of my book is not to understand. Well, it is to understand, but my objective of my book is to give you license to make fun of these people. So what I spent a lot of time doing was, well, you would be surprised. I spoke with, I'd say 9 out of the 10 people I spoke with are liberal, identify as liberal, vote Democratic, wouldn't vote Republican if you paid them. Mm-hmm. And they sympathize with this movement, which is why this movement has been so successful. As a digression, they focus on their own too. It's not introspection per se. It's very externalized, but they focus on the people who are most likely to genuflect to the movement, to lend it power and efficacy,
which is
because you go after a hard target and then you have to slink away after 3 days. You don't look especially powerful. So they do go after their own, and they're very effective at it, leveraging the language of the academy and these pseudo authoritative arguments to try to intimidate. So the people I spoke with primarily agree with the theory, the moral sentiments behind this mission, which is also why the book is organized by virtues. I do try to identify a theoretical, a moral framework that you can at least sympathize with in order to break down its successes. But they're being robbed of the passion they have for their life's work. They would never stop voting Democrat, but that doesn't mean they're going to be enthusiastic about the progressive project, because the progressive project has stolen from them what they want to do in life. They get up every morning unable to cook good food, to write a good screenplay, to broadcast sports. They have to perform politics, and perform very literally politics for the benefit of an audience. That's not what they want to do with their lives. Some of them are actually dropping out of this business, but at the very least, there's a backlash that is incubating among people who think that this has gone too far, not because the ideals are wrong. The ideals are right. It's the practice that's driving them nuts. And that's the fulcrum that you can leverage to create a schism. And that's what I hope to, if I'm wildly successful, that's what I hope to partially incept. My objective here primarily is to have a good time. I wanted to have a good time. I wanted to write the manuscript. I wanted to read. And I hope that you enjoy this book, because there's no cure for the ills of sanctimony that involves more sanctimony. This is an irreverent look at this whole phenomenon.
I'm a firm believer that comedy cures all. I mean, one of the most effective liberals against the progressives is Bill Maher. And he does it with the surgical comedic accuracy.
And drives them up a wall.
Yeah. And he seems to be successful for it, you can only be canceled if you allow yourself to be canceled. And to your point, you kind of mentioned this, that you can really only be canceled from your own side. The left-wingers can't cancel me. They can't.
They've tried.
It's just not, it's not possible. Cancel culture only exists on your own side. And it is that puritanical heretic hunting that is prevalent on the extremes. Because there's nothing more satisfying than going after someone who you believe betrayed you. And this seems to be the progressive operating standard against your classical liberals, right? You say you're so compassionate and you're for these morals that we thought we all agreed on, but you just won't do what it takes and cancel the damn burrito and cancel Paw Patrol and promote the 1619 Project and all its ahistorical nonsense, and so you're out, right? And you shouldn't have a job and et cetera, et cetera. And liberals are very susceptible to that because, of course, they want to be seen as fighters for against injustice and for equality and all of these things. And what I point out to people, philosophically speaking, is it's tougher to be a liberal in that sense because I'm not sure what their philosophical underpinnings are. They're much looser than a conservative's. It's easier to define the conservative philosophical underpinnings. It's not so easy to define the liberals.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why I would venture, and this is a big gamble, but I would venture that the sexual revolution and the mores that evolved from it was a passing fad, because it's not hard to identify the moral underpinnings of the Progressive Project. The Progressive Project has some very rigid moral scriptures, moral constraints, and dogma associated with it. And as it has risen back to the fore, we're seeing, without no coincidence, a remoralization of society in ways that conservatives probably couldn't have even imagined. Again, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the idea that you could reground society in some sort of a rigid moral code that prescribed absolutes for how men and women interacted, and ridding the culture of crass appeals to male sexuality, and perhaps, making the game of football less violent without sacrificing its charm. And this is the sort of thing that you would think would just be fanciful. Progressives have kind of done it. This movement has left its mark on American society. It may leave more marks. And some of them are actually valuable. They have something to say for them. The Puritans, Big P Puritans, left us with an incredible heritage: proto-democratic institutions, an uncompromising abolitionism, a social safety net that ensures you don't have to rely on charity in your darkest hours. These are valuable legacies. The Puritans are not remembered fondly for their efforts. In the popular imagination, they're laughing stocks because of the excesses, because of the zealotry, because of the uncompromising idea of a homogenized society that was never going to be sustainable. I think that's the trajectory that the new Puritans are onto.
You think they're losing?
I don't think they're losing. I think they're creating the conditions that will yield a backlash among their own. They're fostering a resentment that they do not see, but that is very evident below the surface. And it's a collective action problem. Nobody wants to be the first to jump, but collective action problems do resolve themselves because it only takes one person to jump. And you're beginning to see the cracks in the institutional regard for, as you say, of what is probably unquantifiable, but a very small number of progressive, puritanically inclined progressives. They just punch way above their weight for their numbers. But then you see institutions like Netflix buck the pressure, like Spotify buck the pressure, because maybe they've taken the temperature of the room and realized that Twitter isn't really real. There's a very small number of people we're talking about who nevertheless are extremely intimidating. The signs of a backlash are materializing. Now, if that results in a full-scale rejection and defenestration of practitioners of this philosophy, I don't know. But the seeds are there, and the commercial pressure is there. One of the ways that I talk in the end of the book, one of the ways that I talk about, besides reconceptualizing politics as politics, and living a joyful life and having permission to mock people who are making a humiliating spectacle of themselves, is this idea of commercial pressure exerting its influence on this philosophy in ways that undermine it. The parallel that I use is the phrase "banned in Boston." So in 1800s, mainline Protestant New England, epicenter of this sort of censorious moral policing. And the phrase "banned in Boston" described it was a warning against impious literature, impure literature. And the Societies for the Suppression of Vice capitulated themselves, organized in opposition to the very seditious literary experience, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. And they were very effective. They had that play, that book was not published in Boston. And even into the 20th century, books were Baudelarized, plays were banned, dime store novels you couldn't get, even songs were not played on the radio because they were too bawdy. This eventually broke down because outside the country, Banned in Boston stopped being a warning against impure literature and started being a powerful advertisement for it. Publishers actually tried to have their books banned in Boston to increase sales in the rest of the country because this was a titillating literary experience you had to have for yourself. I would say the modern equivalent, if there is one, is banned on Facebook, banned on Amazon, where these books that are targeted by their youthful censors who do not know what they're doing achieve wild commercial success that's disproportionate with the PR campaign around these books. Taboos are meant to be broken. There will always be iconoclasts. That's the price of living in a free society, and it's a low price to pay. This movement seeks to extirpate that. They want to homogenize culture, and the only way you do that is to get rid of taste entirely. This is a war against human nature. I don't suspect it'll be successful, but there will be discomfort before it fails.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think they're starting to lose. I think their success is on the back of the rise of social media and the ability of these fringe elements to really to fake it like they're part of some majority. And it scares CEOs into submission. It scares kind-hearted liberals into submission that aren't well anchored by principles or philosophy. If you say like really terrifyingly menacing things on Twitter and like be a horrible hyperbolic person, you're going to get attention. People will notice you. You'll be heard above the din, but that don't make you a good person. No. Or somebody that you want to emulate. You know, it's not a model of behavior that I think any well-socialized person would actually try to model themselves after in public, you know, maybe in the internet. And they certainly do it on the internet in droves. I mean, like I see it all the time. It's one of the things that makes this job most difficult because that takes up a lot of your time in politics is just dealing with that, whether it's on the left or the right. And a lot less time gets focused on legislating. I mean, these last few days, I'm debunking idiotic myths and conspiracies from the right on what was in a military spending bill, right? Like they're just lying for attention, just like not even close to it, not even a morsel of truth. Sometimes with conspiracies, there's at least some truth to it that they just twist and kind of make into some compelling narrative that they know will get clicks and engagement. But you know, it's really devolved.
They got to get it from somewhere, though. Like
they get it from the progressive left, I think. The tactics.
Tactics, surely, but like, where's the nugget for this conspiracy theory coming from?
Okay, so I mean, the last few days, so the clickbait goes like this: Republicans and Dan Crenshaw, especially because Dan Crenshaw has total control over the military budget, voted.
Congratulations!
I've got a lot of power. Voted to kick out members of the military who didn't take the vaccine. You know, now what they're referring to is we voted to fund the military. Like that's what they're like. So, you know, because, you know, but they don't say that part, right? Like they're not making some policy argument of, you know, we're so against this particular policy that the commander in chief implemented that we think the entire military should be defunded.
That's maddening because that's the selective dishonesty that you would see in a campaign commercial, right? That maybe would get fact checked, maybe it wouldn't, but it's dirty pool and it's effective, which is why people play it. And, you know, maybe it's a simplistic theory, but it's one I subscribe to, that as the parties have sacrificed all this power, this institutional authority and you know, giving it to democracy, big D democracy, everybody feels like they have to fill the vacuum left by effective communication shops and then deems themselves a press spokesperson, deems themselves a combatant in this, and they're not getting a cut of the action. So it's not entirely sure what satisfaction they're getting out of being disingenuous, save that they're advancing the goals of their team, of their tribe, or they think they are.
Well, they're playing upon people's suspicions, right? Like people have gotten naturally very, very suspicious, especially of their own side. and there's a lot of grifters that play off of that. And there's a business model here. You know, you get more engagement, and you get more engagement especially by attacking your own side. You get more engagement by promulgating something that's really out there, because and then the second line is, this is what they won't tell you about. This is what the mainstream media won't talk. I'll talk about it because I have the courage to talk about it, but nobody else is talking about it. And so people are like, oh my God, nobody else. What is he talking about? That sounds so compelling. And I've been looking for somebody who's just willing to tell me the truth. And is that you, anonymous person online? I'm so happy to hear that. And there's other people here too. So there's got to be some truth to it. And this happens over and over again. This is how conspiracies are born. And there's always a grifter at the top who obviously knows better, who's full of crap. And they're trying to infiltrate the mainstream. And exactly what you just said, it's because there is no real establishment. There is no real standardization
that's the dirty little secret that nobody can face up to. We're on our own here. I heard a theory that I actually like, and I'm stealing it because I don't remember where I heard it. But as you know, the idea that as social conventions break down, the sort of unspoken codes of conduct that govern social behavior sort of attenuate, then everybody starts behaving like lawyers and protecting themselves in a lawyerly fashion. And that seems, in a way, what you're describing, this sort of lawyerly way to selectively argue facts in order to influence an audience, not to be genuine, not to be honest, but to manipulate.
Yeah. Oh, it's highly manipulative. And my concern is that just more and more people keep falling for it. And, you know, I'm trying to pull back the veil for as many people as I can and say, look, like, I know you don't trust everything a lot of the legacy media tells you, and perhaps for good reason, they've lost a lot of your trust. That doesn't mean that, you know, redpatriotelephant.com has any answers for you. It doesn't. It's written by 19-year-old grifters living in their mom's basement for the most part. There's a lot of influencers and people who just put out memes. You have no reason to trust them. You don't know them, right? But there's so much trust that's placed in some of these people, and they can swing people's opinions rather quickly. You know, people will be like, Dan, I heard this about you. I saw it online. Like, where did you see it online? A bunch of people saying it. People are saying, but, you know,
if it's a meme, then you should. Did you see it in a meme? Because if it's a meme, you should never trust it. This is like a hieroglyphic that we'll all look back on, and
it's crazy, and it takes up a lot of our time and takes away from doing serious work. And it's honestly just a bunch of young shit talkers online, like, because they enjoy it. They know what they're doing. I don't think they're ideologues by any stretch. But they are opportunists, and there's a lot of good people that are easily persuaded by this stuff because they don't know where to turn.
Yeah, there's plenty of people I've met who are provocative online to a degree that's abhorrent. That you recoil from the language that they use and the themes they touch on, just like really antisocial. And then they're the kind of sweetest, most normal human being in person. There must be there's a thrill that you get from being provocative online. I don't get it, but I understand it. Insofar as it's the attention economy, and you get the endorphin rush of the engagement, the likes, the retweets, whatever it is. There's something satisfying there, and it has something to do with, you know, the food pellet dropping down for you.
It feels so gross to me. You know, I remember when I first got into this business, and, you know, we start doing your typical fundraising emails, and anyone who's ever gotten a fundraising email is like, whoa, what the hell is this? It's just like, your whole life is about to end right now if you don't donate. The Democrats are trying to kill your children. You know, it's like, you know,
it's at the end of the fundraising period.
Yeah, and
the deadline's approaching.
Guys, don't make my fundraising emails like that. it's just not how I talk, you know. And I think I can make a pretty good case for my political stances without wild exaggerations and demagoguery. I think we can do it. Like it. When I look at what moderates are looking for, you don't have to give up any conservative principles, in my opinion. You just have to not be an asshole.
Or be genuine.
Yeah, genuine. Just tell them what you think, and that works. It makes a lot of people angry. I've made a lot of people angry just by being that.
And you're not languishing in the fundraising department either. I mean, it's a model that some can aspire to if they're inclined.
I would hope so. But back to the subjects we were talking on comedy, especially. Do you think comedy is really under threat? Or are we still okay? Are there still enough comedians that are willing to push the envelope? It seems to me that they're still rewarded for it.
They are, but it's finicky. So the big screen, feature length comedic screenplay is a thing that's dying on the vine. It's too risky a venture.
Yeah, you can't make Wedding Crashers anymore. You can't make it's a
non-event, so we don't know what we can't make. It hasn't been made.
Yeah.
But it is on
super
the decline.
bad. Yeah.
Oh God, never.
There's a whole plethora of movies that were so awesome. There's like a whole like comedic golden age, I guess, from like early 2000s, mid 2000s. That you don't see anything like that anymore.
Nope, fallen right off a cliff, and it's in part not because it's not profitable anymore, but because the investment behind it has dried up for fear of incurring social consequences among this very small but committed band of moral crusaders. Likewise, when I talk about in the chapter on comedy, it's not as though you'll never have iconoclastic comedians that challenge taboos. They will thrive in smaller audiences and a more atomized cultural society. We will lose our shared cultural heritage, and the big institutions will commit themselves to this puritanical model, and they will the puritanically inclined will congratulate themselves on sanitizing the culture, but they won't have. They will just have driven what they fear most underground, which will render it unpoliceable. We don't have a shared cultural heritage. The moderates aren't in the room anymore. There is no way to moderate this atomized culture, to police it and ensure some sort of a reasonable equilibrium emerges from it. So you'll have this sort of actual very dark. I'm not saying that the right is incapable of being socially irresponsible and reckless. And that sort of social irresponsibility and recklessness, and yes, provocation, will thrive in dark, warm places that progressives do not see and won't recognize where they are. And maybe it does metastasize into something that they fear it could metastasize into. I think they're being paranoid now, but that's not to say that the theory that they're advancing is wrong. It's in fact probably correct. The only way that I think that we get to a proper cultural equilibrium is the light of day and a shared cultural heritage. And we're losing that because there are commercial pressures now for you to have a much smaller audience. And as you say, an institution that backs you, if you don't have an institution behind you that's committed to the free expression of ideas, the exploration of ideas in whatever form they take, and not punishing you if you step on a landmine, wherever that landmine is, because they constantly move, then you're at risk. And It is a risk to speak up. I understand that. There are consequences for running afoul of this movement. But you can thrive on a much smaller audience that renders you uncancelable. The problem is that much smaller audience also doesn't moderate you or police you. And we see plenty of conservatives too, who are tempted by this very narrow band of committed right-wing provocateurs,
right,
who like to hear antisocial stuff, who get a little thrill from hearing the racist, misogynistic stuff in ways that aren't meant to lampoon it, but to lionize it. Progressives are right to be cautious about that sort of thing. It's just that their conduct, their mission, is making it more of a threat, not less.
I think that's a good way to put it. Their behavior does drive people into those deep, dark corners. And then I'm the kind of guy who has to deal with it
right.
because I'm trying to keep the conservatives on a good track here. And
you're part of the problem in the process.
Yeah. And I was going to say, Joe Rogan would be an example where he wasn't canceled, but back to your point, it did require an institution to back him, right? It required Spotify to back him and say, no, screw you guys. We're keeping it. Because if they hadn't, and YouTube would cancel him too, even somebody like Joe Rogan, there's no platform to get back out to the audience. I mean, it might percolate for somebody that big, but
I mean, if you are gigantic like he is, you probably have a free hand because you can turn right around and do whatever you want, create your own institution. That's not an option that's available to most performers, which is why the the two people that we name, Chappelle and Rogan, are some of the biggest household names in comedy.
Mm-hmm.
That option is not available to most performers who run afoul of this new moral enthusiasm. But there are also fewer and fewer institutions that are responding reflexively to the latest controversy from something that was dug up in somebody's past and applying modern standards to something that didn't make a ripple when it happened 13 years ago. That's a changing of the terms of engagement in ways that I see committed progressives who are absolutely deferential to this movement's philosophy, wholly rejecting its practice.
And that's a good thing. I think there's a level of exhaustion that's occurred there, and thank God for it. And maybe there's something to be said for the backlash from the right, as much as they don't care about that. I don't know if that has anything to do with it. But one other thing you said, which I think is an important part of this, is the tearing down of shared history, of shared cultural norms. That's the really scary part, right? That's where you get to the tearing down of statues of Jefferson and even Lincoln and Washington. I just read a story today, which is infuriating, really detailing how the homes of old homes of Jefferson and Madison have been sort of taken over by these woke nonprofits.
I saw this.
And people are going in and getting tours basically about the 1619 Project. And they're like, what the hell was that? And that's something that you would think we'd be able to fight back against. Because you know what the thing is, I don't think there's a lot of blue-haired progressives who want to go visit those places in the first place. The people who go visit that stuff are like middle America, patriotic types. There has got to be a backlash to this. So this is something I think we're going to highlight and take on. I mean, it's infuriating. And it is this malevolent attempt to deconstruct our own history. Now where you go from there, good luck. I mean, that's very French Revolutionary thinking. That's destructive.
Yeah, there's an element of Jacobinism in a lot of this, and a year zero mentality, which is far less fun than the book I set out to write. That's the consequences of that are far more profound and have more import than the campaign against red meat eating and the effort to get you to eat insects, not because they're palatable, because you're contributing to a social good. That's far more disturbing, but it's the same mentality at work in which the progressive left has sort of stumbled across very old values, very old conceptions of how you break down or recapitulate society and build a year zero mentality, and don't know their history. So don't know that they're emulating failures. And then part of this is this book ends with this cycle that we seem doomed to relive every several decades or so, because the Puritan worldview is a failed philosophy. Puritanical values are something else. The puritanical theory of social organization failed, and it has failed repeatedly throughout our history. We seem doomed to repeat this experiment on a semi-regular basis. And there's an element of that repetition that I suppose is valuable because it's happened so often and American society has persevered. So, the book ends with the assumption that there will be, in a generation or so, yet another very wise, virtuous group who will look upon our era and just mock us and find this puritanical impulse to be utterly ridiculous and abhorrent. And they will be navigating their own moral panics, and they won't be able to see the ways in which they're reinventing their world and going after a year zero mentality, because they're in the middle of it and they're very haughty and believe themselves to be righteous and virtuous enough so that they can judge us. And if that's the case, then the tension endures. Then this perennial generational conflict persists. And since it's been with us for so long, it must be a feature of the American experiment. It's in our DNA. So the only thing we should fear is its last and final release. Hopefully this provides some perspective on where we are in this very disorienting and bewildering reorientation of American political definitions. And that's my secondary goal, I should say, to help you understand this puzzle. Again, my primary goal is to write a fun book that you enjoy reading. Because
help you make fun of the crazy people.
And I wanted to have fun. we were saying before we started recording, I was absolutely miserable in 2020. And it was my hope that I could escape the daily headlines, the riots, the pandemic, the reconceptualization in every American institution of the founding as some horrible, abhorrent, rejection of all that's good and decent. So what did my wife says, what do you want to do? And I said, if I had my druthers, I'd talk to people who are in institutions, conventions that I like, comics, chefs, sports broadcasters, creatives in general. But no, everything's political now. You can't get away from politics. And that ended up being the book. So hopefully this gives you some license to enjoy life again and to make fun of the people who don't.
And you've got a bunch of examples. You mentioned one like insect burgers and things like that. I mean, examples where you can just showcase the extremity that these people have gone to and how ridiculous it is. And of course, make fun of them.
Well, meat eating is revealed to us as a sin. If you scratch the surface of these superficially compelling arguments about its health defects and its environmental impact, you get to a very moral idea of meat eating that aligns perfectly with how Puritans thought about your obligations to your society. It is an affront to the Eden into which we were born. It makes of you a burden on your community. It's a display of wanton cruelty to animals. The Puritans outlawed any blood sports involving animals. And then when you get to the insect eating as this alternative to this morally tainting experience of red meat consumption, the thing you notice is that nobody ever talks about taste. It's never even discussed. Palatability is actually sort of trite, because Americans have a heedless addiction to resource consumption. They're terribly prejudiced against this activity that happens in the third world all the time. It's an enlightening experience. And most of all, you're saving the world. They never very rarely do they think about the fact that maybe it's unpalatable, might be an obstacle to the widespread adoption of insect eating. But that shouldn't even be your focus. It actually kind of detracts from what should be your focus, which is the fact that you're contributing to this perceived social good. You're saving the world.
Mm-hmm. And then killing people in the process. I mean, what's scary about from my position is I can see over and over again how this mindless Puritanism that occurs, and the worshiping of radical environmentalism and Gaia and all this, and how it leads to what can be very grave consequences. And you see that in Sri Lanka, you see that in the Netherlands right now, where, well, especially Sri Lanka, where you could have a serious food shortage.
Yeah.
Netherlands, you could see a serious food shortage if they go through with these insane ideas. You're going to see people freeze to death in the winter because of lack of energy reliability, because of a push towards this green energy. So like it's ironic because it's all predicated on the idea that we have to save humanity. We're going to save humanity by killing a bunch of people now. And if they were being honest, they would admit that it's an anti-humanist philosophy fundamentally.
It's a very, that's the very serious view of this deindustrialization movement in the name of green priorities. But that's in the book too, in a slightly more lighthearted way, because the progressive activists do talk about progress as being the problem, namely the global system of trade that we've only had since 1991. And the triumph of capitalism that has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty, that has reduced malnutrition around the world by close to 10%. It's the commodification of food that has led the progressive activists say to food porn, to the estrangement of you from the soil, and to the exploitation of workers. And so generally, it's this profound miracle of a modern system of nutrition and trade and food and growth and GMOs and everything that goes into ensuring that the population continues to grow and is sustainable. That's the problem. It's progressive against progress.
That's a good place to end. Progressives against progress. That does seem to be the underlying story here. Anything else to add as we wrap up?
No, that's great. Thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that was just fun. It's good subject. Appreciate it, Noah.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I hope everybody checks out the book, Rise of the New Puritans Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun. Thank you so much, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a Twitter account or Instagram or Facebook?
I only have a Twitter account, and it's strictly for work. But you can tweet me at Noah C. Rothman.
Got it. Noah C. Rothman. All right. Thanks for being on, Noah. Great to have you.
Thank you. Take care, Congressman.